A very good morning, everyone. We welcome you all to the second day of the inaugural AHR Symposium 2022, Research Beyond Method.
Through the symposium, we aim to create a platform of ideas, of thoughts, and of questions that pushes one to look beyond the confines of what architectural research is, of how research transcends beyond being a method to find answers through dialogue.
This student-led symposium shall host dialogues with researchers and practitioners whose works lie in the interdisciplinary fields within and beyond the built environment. The aim is to situate this series of dialogues as markers which expand the idea of how research is imagined, practiced, and reproduced.
For the first panel today, Research 101, we have with us Shreyas, Srivatsa, and Sonal Mithal in conversation with Mannat and Yukta, investigating how knowledge is produced. Mannat and Yukta are both fourth-year students of architecture here at State University.
Without further ado, we invite both Mannat and Yukta to take over.
Good morning, everyone. Happy to welcome you all to the second panel of the symposium, the first panel of the day, Research 101. Today, we'll be looking and we'll be exploring research in all its forms. We'll be looking essentially at how knowledge is produced. We're here to understand what goes on from the moment something piques our interest to the moment we submit our findings. Essentially, we'll be looking at the how, when, what, why, and where of any research project.
Research isn't as black and white as it's somehow portrayed to be. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that you read something and then you analyze it and then you write something. We're curious to find out how else it can be done. What are the different ways in which knowledge can be produced? What are the different ways that we can procure knowledge? And then what are the other different ways that we can actually publish those findings and make them accessible to the public? So we have with us today Sonal Mithal and Shreyas. Thank you for joining us.
A brief introduction to both. Sonal Mithal is a conservation architect and artist, and an educator with a doctoral degree from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. As an educator at State University and as a practicing architect, conservation architect, artist, and researcher at People for Heritage Concern, her work primarily transects architecture, landscape architecture, history, heritage, and peer study. In that transect, she is committed to processes. She's committed to processes and agencies of ecological survival, contingencies of identity and representation, and emergent intersectionality as central to the shaping of the built environment.
Thank you for joining us. Shreyas is a researcher, practitioner, and an academic across multiple disciplines, and has carried out studies based in various cities in India and South Asia. Qualified as an architect and possessing an advanced training in areas related to human settlements, his research and practice is on maintaining transdisciplinary networks, academia, community collaboration, and place-based action research. He is currently teaching at the Faculty of Law, Environment and Planning Cluster, is the head of studies for the M-Plan in Urban Design, Sustainability and Conservation, and is a core member of UNESCO Chair in Culture, Habitat and Sustainable Development at Srishti Manipal Institute of Art, Design and Technology in Bangalore. He is also the co-creator and coordinator of Deccan Living Labs Network and Forum, a place-based research organization practicing with communities and institutes in the Deccan region in India. Shreyas is also a core member of Design Deco Collective. Thank you so much for joining us.
So now, over the course of the presentation and the panel, we'll be looking to answer three major questions. We'll be looking to answer how to begin a research project, what ways there are to extract and interpret information to produce knowledge, and the third being, what are the research paper which doesn't end up as an academic paper in the clinic. With this, we begin our panel with the first topic of how to choose a topic in the first place. Our first question is addressed to you both. Architecture and design itself as a field so broad, that it sometimes becomes very difficult to find your area of interest. And with so many options to study, how do you find your niche? How do you position yourself?
All right. Okay. How do you choose a topic? I think it's very difficult and very broad question at the same time. I think maybe I would have had a different answer when I was your age, because I was also looking for topics to choose from, right? And but now I think I have a very different position, and that is like, you know, some of the questions that come to you, because I mean in my practice also something that there is something inherently wrong in the architecture discourse at the moment. And the more you believe in that, the more the questions will come to you. And it doesn't mean that those questions are not existing. It's just that you are able to relate to them more. And it's like that question will choose you. You are in that position that you don't have to go choosing like how you begin research. So something where, I mean, what I'm calling or inviting you to think is like allow yourself to one be seduced by the inconsistencies of the profession, at the same time have an activist agenda as well. Like, you don't look for comfortable, I mean, there are some comfortable questions, but there are some very uncomfortable questions to which you probably do not have an answer to. And that is where you want to tread. There is a lot that has to be said about the trends, the trending topics. I look at those trending topics in a very positive way. Because it's not fashionable to do something, but some subjects or some aspects are trending because that is the predominant ideology of the time. It's the zeitgeist of the time. Say, for example, today gender inequality or representation of gender and sexuality across forums is being asked for. We cannot not look at that. So sometimes the trends in quotation marks also push you to become part of that conversation as part of a responsibility. So those are the ways, like gender or equality, climate change. So these are things that become part of our responsibility, and these are the questions that are not, we don't have real answers to that. So to become part of that research is also a sense of taking responsibility for something that our profession owes. And I don't know if that answers your question, but basically allow the question to choose you rather than you choosing the question.
I can add to what Sonal started. In terms of research, it's really important to start off with understanding what the word itself means, right? Because so casually used, and it's also seen as in some way very precursory process that any discipline, or especially architectural research, is framed in a certain way, and then the outcome of the research is seen as a different process altogether. So basically what I'm trying to kind of say is, when you say research and you position it within a discipline, like Sonal mentioned, as times change, the discourses are also changing, and depends really on which kind of dominant discourse are we part of at that time. Right? So while my graduation, some of the ways in which I thought what research would be has completely changed in the last 16, 17 years. And what was considered to be, important or key research that has to be taken up in the space of, say, architecture or urban planning, that has also shifted quite a bit. But then I think I've come to kind of realize that research is not about knowledge production or new knowledge production or even discovering new knowledge, but it is more about learning. Right? It starts off as a process of learning where you go with your curiosities and not to kind of, like I said, the discourses and the concerns of our times are also constantly influencing our choices and where we go, what kind of questions we ask. So research, if you look at it as a process of learning, then you would see that research is not something that has a very clear starting point or an ending point. It's part of continuously how you learn and how you kind of build your curiosities, and also how do you convert all of that into action as well. Right? Largely, if you look at yourself as a practitioner, then how does research fit into a practice? What does it enable? What are you learning? Where do you go? And what are the kind of complexities that a place holds? Right? So it's mostly saying that research is something that everyone has to think about what it really means for them. And it really helps when you actually decenter it from a discipline. Then you are probably listening to the ground when you work. Because most of us do work in place-based contexts. Right? So either in architectural history or architectural research or anything to do with places, it's a very, very specific context that we all work in. And when you go to a place, it has its own kind of theoretical code. What kind of gets the place going? What are the different kinds of communities? What are their positionalities also, which is not something that they're consciously choosing, but it is part of their everyday life. Right? So when you go to a place, how do you start to orienting yourself and being a good listener and observer, than have a question and an intended outcome, and then you go there and you fit your research to suit your final outcome. And it's also got to do with how disciplines have looked at research most of the time, where there is emphasis on building some form of hypothesis or problematizing and then trying to kind of have research questions that are coming from there, and then emphasis on the methods and how those methods are also like leading to actions. So it's a very linear way. Most often the disciplines kind of talk about research, but then if you look at research as part of your living practice, then what would it really mean? So it's an open-ended question. I think everyone will have their own version of what research would mean for them. But try to kind of decenter it from a discipline to see what research would mean and what learning really means. So it's more about like how do you learn to learn about a place.
Could you tell us a little more about the kind of research that you're doing right now? Both of you.
Okay, so the kind of more than kind of research, I would say kind of practice, because largely for me, research is very closely linked to the practice that I'm also kind of discovering for myself. It's not that I know very clearly what my practice is also. So right now it's at the intersection of doing some bit of teaching. How do you kind of push the boundaries in terms of how do you go to a place and learn from the place, right? And as a process of learning with the students, because way too often we go to a place and we're trying to discover different aspects of it. So largely, I would say my research right now, after like 16, 17 years, is what I've kind of started to call as situated practice, where I kind of place my practice in a particular region over a longer period of time. And it is not, the intent is not to do research, but it is to learn about the place. Because as you kind of engage with the place repeatedly, right, you will start to realize that places don't really function based on the way disciplines are structured. So it's not like, one day the place is thriving on architecture, on the other day it is thriving on economy. These are all like, things that are constantly interacting with each other. So when you go there, it becomes more difficult, at least I felt. It's difficult for me to just wear one disciplinary hat or multiple disciplinary hats. Rather than that, how do you then go to a place, learn about the place from the people who are living there, right? Because they are also knowledge producers in so many ways, because they belong to that place, they've been living there. So it's like when you are in your hometown, there is a sense of familiarity. You don't necessarily think a lot in terms of what choices you're making or what decisions you take. It's more like you know the place and you know how to kind of move around, navigate, negotiate, and even if there is conflict, like how do you then manage that conflict? So for me, I think situated practice is very much like a living practice, where you go and you're situating your practice in a place with the people and you're learning there. So it's more than research. I think it's kind of co-learning and co-living in these places, which I have started to call something called as in-betweens. Because when you say a research project, it has like a start and an end point. There is no escaping that. Or you do any kind of a practice-based project as well. It has clear deliverables, or like there is an intended outcome. There's somebody who's putting stakes into the project, and you can't really like get away from all of that. But then there is an in-between that you start to kind of create when you're situating yourself in a place where conversations start happening of a different kind, which is very casual, very candid. We are not really like having a conversation very objectively about what should we do for this particular project. Sometimes the conversations could be us sharing what we are doing otherwise, or somebody saying, "Aapko pata hai, yahan pe chai bahut achhi milti hai," and the entire conversation is only about the chai and nothing about the project or research. And I think some of the students who came to be there can tell you how that kind of works, and it kind of changes the way you embed yourself in a place. And a lot of unlearning and unschooling has to happen there, because I've been trained as an architect and also coming from a planning background. So after like 12 years of conditioning as to this is how a project has to take place, this is how an impact can be made through these kind of, say, research or practice, you tend to kind of start unconditioning yourself and then start seeing life as it happens, and then you let that kind of evolve. And at this point of time, I don't necessarily say what my research should be. It's mostly like collectively what gets, how the conversation goes. Abhi ke liye ye interest hai, this is the resource that we have, let's go with it, right? So it's almost like becomes part of your living day-to-day kind of thing. So that boundaries between practice, research, discipline, they all start to kind of sorry, long answer.
I have similar and a little slightly diverse answer to that. So yes, it's very hard to say where research ends and when practice begins because primarily they're all. And I mean, try examples. Like I don't think so we can always eliminate research from our lived reality. We're constantly researching. We are researching what to eat, how do you want to wear, and what routes to take to avoid this guy, and we're constantly doing that. And so the research is always embedded in, I think, how best can we navigate towards. Now, what kind of research I'm doing? It's again like the same. Like there is conducting studios and some publications are coming out of that, and also like, but more or less, like I think in whatever I do, I think of it as very extremely mainstream. And even if it is asking questions that may be on the margins, my agenda is to make it mainstream. So I always hence look at it as if it's the core. I situate myself in the center of the discourse, like even though the discourse would not want me to be the center, but that is how I'm looking at it. So which means that what is the research that we do? It's very methods-based. My agenda is to create a method for the question. That method is developed primarily from the question itself. It's not an already laid out method. And so that makes your research very significant. Like, it is then unique. I am not even saying it's unique or something. It just gives you a little bit more confidence to ask further questions. How do you break it down? And there are two aspects to it. It's not like, I rely a lot on methods on a variety of methods that are already available. Like discursive methods. Again, that way I'm very, very mainstream. So it's like, all right, if we are getting into a post-humanist inquiry of design, I will ensure that, there is, like to my students and to myself, there is access to as much of post-humanities discourse that is possible. And to break it down, such that it's relevant to us. That breaking down such that it's relevant to us is a very big issue, and that is part of the research. The breaking, because people write what they have to write, that is their question. To become part of that method, we are trying to learn what their method is, but extract what is relevant to us. Extracting what is relevant to us without, I'm not saying extracting out of context, so extracting like cherry picking. Extracting within the method, such that you are then, there is this one question, like, all right, I'll give you an example. So, Haraway says that we are in this world where now the world is like, there is trouble. And we have damaged the planet. But we can't sit on that lamentation that, hey, we've damaged the planet. Our research cannot stop there. That, hey, we show like 2,000 examples of how we have damaged the planet, because it's not enough. And it's also, according to that discourse, she says that, we can't now go back. Humans will keep doing what we have to do, which is like damage the planet. And, so you cannot take a moral position to say that we have to go back to that pristine. Then it's not going to happen. So then she is bringing in some other ideas, cyborgian living and all that, which combines like cohabitative, coexistent, and looking at human as like one part of the species, as just one of the species. So now this is what does it mean then to bring it into how will it become an architectural design agenda? So the question is a very mainstream agenda. Architects, I really feel that architects cannot shut off the responsibility of building. Like, we have to build. I mean, that is what is expected out of us. So if there is this discourse in which you are attaching your question then the question is, what is that architecture that comes out of this discourse? That nobody else will answer except you. And so the research then becomes, all right, what is that architecture that comes out of this kind of a thinking? So those are some of the questions that I'm asking from, ecology perspective, or more recently, like reminding gender issues, which are also part of the same discourse. What does it mean? See, there is like a ton of material there. You go to feminist conferences and you'll see that they are talking a lot about marginalization and how people are in this wage labor gap and things like that. People are not getting to practice enough and so on. But then in my work, I am wanting to make it like, how can this question become mainstream? So the mainstream to architecture discourse. So my question right now is that if you have a responsibility to design for the marginalized, what would the design be? And so the design cannot be like you provide for women and you provide, because that may like lighten the discourse. It's a more complicated thing. So the more complex you make the question, the more deeper you go into the question, the more complex it becomes, and maybe it becomes difficult to answer what is that space that gets designed. But the question for me still remains that. Even though I may not be able to answer that question, but the question still remains very central to architectural practice, which is the design of the space. So these are the kind of questions I'm looking at some of the there are two publications that I'm working on. I still don't have a publisher. They eventually we start the self-publication. I'm just putting on a lecture or something. But it is like primarily coming out of ecology, feminist ecologists who have been giving this idea of co-habitative living. So what they have been writing, how does that break down into architectural deliverables and this idea of aesthetic? It's very, very tangible. So extracting tangibles and making it converting it into architectural language and then giving it. So those kind of things.
So this is quite interesting. I think a common link that we can find in both of these, I think, different methods of research is what you said at the start, where you're allowing the question to find it, and you're allowing essentially the space-based research to find for that question to find where you possibly do it through trends and what concerns we have in our society today, and attaching yourself onto those concerns. We have found a research topic in that sense, something of interest. How then do you think, possibly even taking an example of through your projects, you go on to build a narrative around it? What does this, how do you select what is going into your research and what is relatable, what is related but not valuable? And then how do you filter that data?
I think primarily the answer to everything lies in method. That's why it's research beyond method, but I think it's very much methods for me. There's nothing beyond method. It is an ongoing method. So the method will tell you. And that is where it's very important to, you can change your, the lens. We say the word lens and things like that. But I use the word method. And method allows for many lenses to simultaneously work with each other. The moment you have a lens, the lens is a filtering agent. So, if you have a post-humanist lens, you can't be talking about transcendental phenomenology. You can't be talking about hyperbole, right? So automatically some things get filtered out. And the lens or the method is one that will help you filter things out. I'll give you a slightly easier example, a slightly more relatable example. Is like, I also work on mainstream projects that are given by government, which are commissioned by government. So now, and this is coming from one of my professors, and she, Untitled at SPA. She always felt that, strive to work for public projects that are commissioned by government, no matter what the government is, because it brings a lot of credibility to your project. That is one thing. But to work for government is very difficult because you don't have an option. Even if you propose something, it's bound to, get jailed, it will become very, very vanilla. It just becomes that. So now you have to figure out ways in which you can just do a little bit of guerrilla, this thing, and you're doing very actually. Some things like that. So, so I give you like recently I'm working on this metro, Gujarat metro, artwork. And so they said we want very vanilla shaped chitas, which are shaped and kites. We want some panels that are doing that. And I'm like, okay, we'll do that. But now the shaped cheetah, the way you represent the shaped cheetah or the way you represent, that is where the method comes in. Right? So what are the things that you are going to look into? You can make a generic kite and do away with it. Or you can look at, you can give yourself that challenge. I don't want to be exotifying that representation. So you put a rule to yourself that it's restricting you to create a certain kind of an illustration. The moment you put a restriction to yourself, it's a method. You are so some things get already filtered out. So that is a rule you put together. It's very simple. And you don't have to say that to them, right? Because you will still eventually give them shaped cheetah and all that, right? But you have to put a rule to yourself. So then the research is always ongoing and it's already part of your understanding. I don't know if that answer. The filtering part is it's coming from the method. I mean, here, what is the method here? It's like something that, again, at least I have the privilege of now after 20 years of researching. I want to put my foot down that no exotification. I'm anti-exotification. So that is where I would say, all right, in my illustrations, at least even if it is a public project, I will not do that. So it's a filtering mechanism. I don't know how much it's successful because they always like it's not working. We will not put this illustration. We're still struggling, but at least we can try.
While I completely agree that it's driven by method, but also I think it's important to understand what we mean by methods. And are you, again, where are you drawing your understanding of method? So for me, I think methods are something that we can co-create. So especially when you're working on ground with both different people, different communities. Disciplinary methods are mostly inward-looking, as in within the fraternity of a discipline, what gets discussed and agreed upon as a method that can be replicated over a period of time. And then still it becomes a way of drawing inferences or even building actions, right? So then when you again say in a place-based research or place-based work that I'm doing, and when we talk about transdisciplinarity, it immediately starts to acknowledge that there are different forms of knowledge production. And the methods that you take, say, as an architect, most often may not be something that is accessible to everyone where you're going to a place. So how do you then look at a method which will allow for others to kind of come? So there have been so many participatory projects that we know of also. especially informal settlements. If there's a government project that has an in situ operation or in informal settlements and bastīs, how many different kind of actors have come together to create a participatory process, which tries to center the requirements of the people. But then again, there are like certain, we have to be very, very critical and closely observe what is really happening on ground, because way too often the way we share these things publicly is in a very, very condensed form. You synthesize, and many of the nuances of, say, how do you work with communities gets fizzled out, because the narrative that you want to always construct is the narrative of success, right? Like what is working. You want to always put your foot forward and say that this is what is working, this is a great method, or this can be used, and you start kind of pushing for that. But then when you're working on ground, you'll also realize that the methods get altered. And when you're opening that up, and when your agenda also is a little, it gives you direction, but it's not something that you're holding on to very, very closely. And you let it kind of evolve once you hit the ground. You'll start seeing the methods that you go with most often are not good enough. You will have to kind of rethink, reimagine some of those methods. And how do you capture all of these also? It's I'm sure when I'm narrating all this, it may seem extremely vague. But to give you an example, one thing that we have when I started working in either 2016 with a bunch of students from Shreyas, we started to kind of just ask curious questions around the walled city of Bidar, which has so many old settlements, monuments, and also families that are living there over many generations too. And we wanted to understand how does the city and the residents of old city, how are they constantly kind of shaping the old city. And this is also coming in the backdrop of a large portion that is actually protected by ASI, and bringing all the necessary regulations of what you can, what you can't, having different buffer zones. What does it really mean to live with heritage sites also, right? Because it just ASI recognizing a particular monument as protected monument kicks in different kinds of regulations which directly affects the everyday life of people who are living around it. So we went with that, and then I think we found an amazing bunch of volunteers and a civil society organization called Team Yukta, who had been working on ground on very simple spot fixing kind of activities, right? So doing cleaning drives or tree plantation, constantly kind of monitoring what kind of public work projects are happening in Bidar, and seeing that if the projects are going on track, what are the kind of local politics that are making an impact and trying to kind of nudge, and all this does not happen in a very methodical way. It happens as soon as something is happening, you immediately are there. So if there is a highway that is coming very close to, say, the source well for the Khare's system, which is there in Bidar, which is one of the available groundwater recharging and distribution system. They're immediately there with the concerned department at the place, trying to kind of know what really is happening. Is it going to make a major impact? And if they have to push back on it, then what should they be doing? Who should they be talking to? So when you go to a place and when you're working with different sets of people, you realize that there are methods for sure. Everyone has their own methods, but then you as a researcher, when you go, how do you allow for your methods also to kind of morph as you go about doing it? It's quite a tricky idea, by the way, because what I'm talking about is like when you go there with a certain intent, and then you go there and you realize nothing that you have planned is actually working out, because the ground reality, and there are multiple realities over there, and it starts from many different kinds. It's like when I go, it took me a while to also realize that what kind of a privileged position I was coming from. Right? It's very easy for me to kind of wear the hat of an expert and say like, what should be done? This is going to be the solution. Okay, I understand what your problem is. So it starts out by saying, no, I don't understand what the problem is. Let's sit and have this conversation, and let me even understand what's really going on over there. So most often, problematizing is something that I don't do at all, because the people who are living in the city, they know the problems way too well, very intimately. They have a tacit understanding of how things may pan out. So even when you kind of tendencies there, right? Like again, I've been conditioned in a certain way. So the tendency to always looking for structure in what we do is always there. And we most often the structure becomes only like a direction. It's not really clearly telling us what exactly has to be done. So there are different projects. Like project mode is a different mode, by the way, right? Because when you're going for a project, then we had done this project called PHC Archives, either Heritage Center Archives, which started out in a very interesting way. The project was never supposed to be an archive. It started out as a police museum. The police department in Bidar just invited us because I was from a design school, and our students had gone there, and the district administration folks met with us, and they were happy to see that a design school from Bangalore has come to Bidar, and they are showing interest in local culinary practices, linguistic practices, how living with heritage or even spatial transformation in heritage parts of the city is making an impact, and looking at new enterprise models that could be more attuned to the ground realities of some of the communities. So they just called and they asked, like, again, they reached out to team who were working very closely with district administration, and reached out to me saying that we have the police department is going to be the police department in Bidar has a long history because it was part of the Nizam Republic, which had a very different kind of an organizational structure compared to the other places where the police departments were. That's also got to do with the subsidiary alliance that the British had with Nizams at that time. So there is a very particular legacy to the police department in the Hyderabad, Karnataka region and in Bidar. One of the buildings which was built at the time of the Nizam Dominion more than like 125 years ago. So they wanted to kind of look at the police museum, which could tell public and give public like a narrative around how this history has gone. And at the same time also make police processes less intimidating. So this was like the vision that the SB at that time had in mind. So that's how the whole conversation started. But then very soon since the conversation was not just limited to, say, me, Srishti, and a bunch of other designers, it was also happening with Team Yuva. We were also meeting with some of the senior journalists who had been covering or writing articles around culture and heritage in Bieber. So the conversations kind of just kept happening, and then finally we realized, why are we limiting this to this police museum? Why don't we look at this as a possibility to look at ordinary histories of people who have been living and shaping the city over a period of time, right? So again, we wanted to kind of use, say, how an alternate history, an alternate narrative to the history of the place could possibly lead us to alternative ways in which we could think of development. Because this was also the time when UNESCO had come up with their heritage, historic urban landscape framework, culture 2030 agenda, right? So again, these were all thought process that was happening at that point of time. And then we said, like, let's try to kind of, find something, find a way to build this archive of ordinary histories. So it kind of expanded, and it was no longer just a museum project. But then the downside of all these kind of, experimentation is also, like, it has immediate impact on the outcome as well. So one could always say, like, if we had stuck to police museum, maybe police museum would have been there. But now, the police museum is not there, but there is an archive, which is not necessarily something that everyone can access quite easily. But then it's an ongoing process again. So it never ended for us. So although the project duration was 1 year, but this archive is something that we've been building over a period of time, which is also kind of becoming like a transdisciplinary knowledge repository, right? And how you could build actions using that. It requires a lot of concerted effort. Okay? It's not, because constantly you keep asking the same question, like, okay, where are we heading with this? Okay, are we going to be do anything on ground at all? But then now and then there would be one ray of hope that will come in the form of like a project who are able to kind of understand what we're trying to do. Not something everyone can get, right? So the conversations, and they're very interesting conversations and stories, I can tell you how this entire process works. But project notes are purely incidental for us, right? Since we are embedded in the region, constantly what we are trying to do is how do we use academia, community collaboration as a way of driving or experimenting, because the potential of research in academia is not just of publishing and building knowledge repositories for disciplines, but it is actually going beyond methods, right? And trying to find new ways of collaboration. It's okay to fail. There's a learning that comes from that kind of failing also, or even struggling with some of these questions, which you generally don't tend to kind of get that kind of a luxury when you're out in the world of practice, because it's largely determined by how projects are done, how organizations have set their visions, what are their aims and objectives, of course, revenue targets, right? So there are many of these factors at play, but academia and community collaboration has a lot of potential or possibilities that it can open up. While we are also, as practitioners, embedding in a place, and it evolves over a period of time. So PHC archive is one kind of an example where we started out with very little knowledge about the place, right? And then now, as we kind of kept adding, we realized there are so many occupation-based communities that are still active in Bieber. Many of these are also coming with what we see as oppressed castes, because it's not at some point when you start off archiving, there is a sense of a gaze and spectacle that you're trying to kind of find something that you can archive. But after a certain point, you realize that it's no longer archiving, which is what you're doing. It's essentially trying to kind of work with communities and their experiences, lived experiences, right? Where as a person of privilege, I can't really even imagine what they all must have gone through. And when we talk about future development, all these kind of words, they are so exclusionary in the way they have been framed over many decades. And also the idea of development itself is so colonial in nature, where it started out by actually setting a benchmark for what a developed country looks like. And then the rest, all the countries are like, underdeveloping or underdeveloped countries. So there are these politics that usually disciplines also use and they influence. And how do you then keep kind of unconditioning or unschooling yourself from these dominant narratives that are there? So yeah, I think it's not an easy space. It's a lot of space for like self-reflection, positioning yourself, and also realizing that, or being just humble as a practitioner. Go to a place or do a project where you're centering it around learning rather than solving, right? Solving some of these complex problems, it requires a lot of concerted effort to solve. Of course, if I'm given a time-bound exercise and I'm asked to kind of come up with 10 solutions, maybe I come with 10 solutions, but none of them will work.
Yeah, I want to add to that. I think more than problem solving, it's also a large part about revealing what are the inherent complexities and contestations that are there. Large part of research or your engagement in such kind of practices is that. But what I'm hearing from you, Shreyas, is like something very provocative, and which also I strongly believe in, is claiming space. So when you get projects such as this, which are incidental, or once in a while, sometimes, or I'm talking about having government projects which give you the credibility. I see it as a way of claiming mainstream space. And once you have that space given to you, even though just for a short period of time, that is where you bring your narrative to. Then if you go with the narrative that is expected of you, then you will probably lose that opportunity of having claimed the space. And that is where you just, in whatever small way, if you can like switch the narrative a little bit, like making an archive instead of a museum, or giving in Kerala, illustrations where we are talking about Surat having beef-eating practices and things like that for another project. And situating it, knowing full well it's going to get passed because nobody will care to read it. That is, so it's like you have the space, you do it, and so how it can be good, it can be more face aggressive or something like that. But what is very important is to claim this space. And that is why then center stage things that have so long continued.
It's really interesting that you both spoke about methods, and you spoke about your time in Mithal, you've spoken about your work with Ahmedabad and the metro. I think it might be a little interesting for all of us to know about you and the kind of work that you do in Mithal, and how exactly you go about getting, the kind of information that you need. What is your method to obtain the data that you require for your project? Similarly, you worked in Champaner, you worked in Surat. What are the methods that you follow to collect data, basically?
These are work that we are doing with living labs and also college public pedagogy or place-based learning with our studios and Srishti. It's been a journey. Okay? So there is no one method or like a collection of methods. And I'm talking about like again starting off say in 2016 and sustaining that year. So just to kind of give you a little bit of backstory here. Again, I may not be able to give you very specific methods that you can say that okay, I want to use this method in my project kind of answer. After like we did the first studio, and usually like in any academic institution, right, the first engagement was in an academic space. It was a studio that was done for 4 months, and we started to kind of build some form of relationships over there. And again, like I said, thanks to Team Yuva because they are extremely like forthcoming. And if I don't think, looking back now, if we hadn't met Team Yuva, Vinay, Supriya, Dilip, Sabeej, so many members from Team Yuva, if we hadn't met them, I don't think our engagement would have been the same way we had. Bidar is a place I think you all should visit because it's there's some kind of an attraction in that place. Once you go there, you kind of fall in love with that place, right? It's not the research interest or like project that you want to do. It's just that it kind of keeps pulling you back. And like I said, 2009, 9-10 is when at first went to Bidar. While I was working with Professor Basara and Bakul Jani, who were also like part of Center for Conservation Studies in SEP, and they had like a joint venture with ASI. So I was part of like one documentation project, and that's when I went to that place. And if you can ask all the members of that team, right? Bidar अपने ज़हन में आ चुका था. It was already in. And when I started to teach full time in 2016 and having a meeting when our director said, do the studio in Bidar. Because we have UNESCO chair in culture, habitat, sustainable development industry. And we had like, we wanted to see this can become like a regional focus. So we went ahead and it was just like, the first studio that we did, but then it was meeting Team Yuva and senior journalists and some of the community members like craftsmen and some of the women from some of the Muslim communities in Old City who were quite generous and open to welcome us during the Ramzan time, because that it was around the same it was a time when the city was had its own kind of a rhythm, right? So whatever we had planned, it went for a toss immediately because the people's daily routines did not really match what we had planned. So we let the kind of city also to kind of take over our interests or like take over what we wanted to do. So the method in some ways has been like, we all knew that it's something that we all can do together. It was very intuitive. Even when conversations were happening, we never like, spoke of problem or solving a problem or being very objective in terms of what is that we want to produce. It was constantly driven by curiosity and like, just knowing more about the city, the residents and different cultural landscapes that were there. And once the studio got over, there was sudden void, right? Because now studio is over and then until the next studio happens, there's nothing much that usually happens. So what at that point of time, I had to like, make this kind of a decision that let me go there, even if there is no project, no studio. I mean, I didn't have any purpose, like defined purpose to get back to be there. And that was something that I was repenting after 2009-10 because I never went back. Right. So this time I wanted to just go back. And since we had met Team Yuva, it was nice to kind of meet them, sit in one of the chai kades and talk endlessly and go to different places, see, look at the grasslands at the peripheries, or go to the kades and see how the kades is working. So these were all like, I mean, it may seem very touristy, but it was not touristy. It was just like, we just wanted to go and hang out together mostly. So even when there was no studios and all, so I would end up being there in Mithal for no reason. Just call Vinay and say like, I'm coming, will you guys be available? And then I would just land up there and Gurudwara, this Gurudwara in Mithal, and amazing guest room facilities. So it was quite affordable too. I could actually spend from my own pocket and not really expect for any kind of funding to be there. So this kind of back and forth, as in studio and non-studio time, kind of kept happening for about 3 years. Until then, we didn't even know what exactly was happening. But we were all all the time excited, energized, just go there and do whatever we can. So there was, in a way, no particular purpose to what we were doing. But we had the time, or rather, I had the time. I could afford because I was not doing the studio or a thesis project myself, where you have to go and submit your thesis, end your student life, and think about your future. I didn't have those kind of constraints, so it was a little more flexible that way. Don't try doing that in your DRPs. For 3 years this happened, and then one fine day we just realized, maybe there is something that we are doing right, because the network kept growing. There were more people who were interested in working with us, and we were not really publishing this material. Nobody was it's not like we were getting recognition to our work or we were getting grants to do projects. This was all just either through studios or we just going and visiting people, spending time, knowing, having very casual conversations. Sometimes people would call us for lunch or dawat to their house. It was very, very casual that way. So after 3 years, we started to kind of see what is that we are really doing, what is our approach. Rather than saying this is the method that we are using, or this is the approach that we are using, we started to have this conversation, what is that we are doing. So that's when the idea of the living labs, although we had called either as our living lab in 2016, it didn't have any kind of meaning at that point in time. So this kind of retrospectively looking at say either studios or projects or in-betweens that we had created for ourselves, we started to kind of say that, okay, here is a network. How do we think of a network-based organization? And that too, it's a place-based organization, right? So we kind of came up with our own kind of taxonomy or lexicon, saying that places are essentially a collection of micro-contexts. And these micro-contexts could be of different kinds. Could be driven by a community, or it could be centered around a practice, or it could be a governance system that is important to kind of understand. So the micro-context really became something that kind of gives us what we are curious to learn and understand, which will allow us to build the network and maybe to take some collective actions around it. Right? So in a way, our method, so to speak, has been these kind of, you do it, you kind of then look back and see what exactly how things are going. Because in a network, you're essentially maintaining it. You're not controlling it, right? So if you visualize a kind of a network graph here, we started to kind of map what are these different micro contexts that we have learned in the last 30 years. So when we started to kind of populate that, that was like an overwhelming list of like some 64 micro contexts in Bidar, Gulbarga, which started to kind of emerge. Until then, we hadn't done an exercise like that, where we wanted to consolidate or synthesize and see exactly what's happening. So I think it's these in-between spaces and then moments of synthesizing where everyone has had like has shaped it in a certain way. So it's no longer like my method. It's essentially like the method is what happens when we are together. It just happens, right? But again, like I said, the key of structuring things in a certain way kicks in. So we kind of went all out to kind of say what kind of what are the modes of engagement that we have, what are the different micro contexts that we have worked in. How do we then think of a network-based organization which is situated around care and situated around some of the feminist principles of thinking about care, right? Like how do you and where the scholarship really lies, who holds that scholarship, and within the network, can we think of a hierarchy which is mostly driven by the network and not something that is imposed upon by a few of us who are constantly kind of working. So these were like questions that we started to kind of ask, and it's been very exciting journey, and also it can get a little bit of a struggle sometimes, but a good one, which basically gives a lot of learning. And of course, the pandemic, I think the last 2 years of pandemic also played a huge role on how the network also kind of started to behave. Because everyone was basically going through their own kind of struggles during the pandemic. So in a network like this, we had to immediately shift our focus. It was no longer about living labs. We didn't really worry about what kind of projects or what kind of actions we want to take. All our focus and resources were then immediately focused towards how do we do relief work for those who are directly impacted by the lockdowns, not just the pandemic, right? It's also the lockdowns which actually started to create a lot of problems. Places, smaller towns and districts, non-Bangalore districts, right? Which essentially didn't have access to resources the way Bangalore district had. So it required many of us trying to kind of come and work together and support in whichever little ways. So for about 2 years, the network was just non-existent, right? And we didn't even try to kind of push for anything. But now when we are coming back, it takes a lot of time, and we have to give the time for everyone to find their own place. So the network that we talk about, the transdisciplinary network or communities that I'm talking about, is extremely fragile and it's extremely loosely put. So it is not like you come to be there and the network is thriving over there. So the methods also are extremely situational and also ethical, right? Many times you have to think about what is that you want to do, and especially when you're working with different actors. It's not just your own practice, right? So if you want to kind of learn something on your own and it does not have any impact on the others in their lives, that's okay. But then when you're going out there and you want to do research in a place where others are living, it's not a research site for them, but it's their home. you have to be a little more conscious of what is that you're also doing. Are you really disrupting their life by actually going there and trying to do some kind of a study or a project? Or is it is this the time that you must carry out this research, right? Or a project, whichever that is. So having these kind of, I think it's a ongoing conversation, and you have to constantly keep getting the reading from the ground, like what's happening, and especially when you're away from the field, it's difficult to get that kind of a reading. So research, I think, like planned or very directed research happens only like short bursts. It's most of the time that we spend is mostly on familiarizing, building that curiosity, and finding that thing that actually motivates you to learn about it. It's not something that, say, somebody asks you to learn about and you go there and you learn. May not be the driving factor for you. So the directed research happens only in like short bursts, and it's only in the moments when we try to kind of synthesize is when most of the critical questions around within the discipline starts to kind of becoming important. But there are other times when I don't think I think about discipline when I'm working on ground at all, and definitely not an architect, definitely not a planner, right? So how do you be there on the ground and listen to the ground, and then finding ways to kind of synthesize different ways?
Are we ready? So, evidence. How do you find evidence? I am, again, very mainstream, and I look for evidence in mainstream locations. And as an architectural historian, the most mainstream location would be the archive. Now, archive is very, very political and problematic at the same time. You will not find the marginalized there. So there is already, archive is constituted by a method of erasure. That is the constitution of an archive. So how do you find something that is already erased? And you only have access to the archive. Like, because as a researcher, you do have some privilege of being able to access that archive. So now the evidence is that evidence is of something which has caused an erasure, but it's not the evidence of the erasure itself. So you work with the mainstream evidence, you work with that, but then the whole method is like devising a method to use that same mainstream evidence to find out what it might have erased. So the evidence is also embedded in the method, and the method is going to allow you to read that evidence in a certain way. So you constantly are politicizing. I think yesterday Avni was talking about reading the Mannat, he was talking about reading the Singh. And that is something that is that becomes central if you are working. If your question is to find out what are the histories of erasures or conflicts or confiscations, but you only have access to something which is which has predicted, which is predicated on having wanting to erase something. For example, currently I'm working on a book with one of my ex-students and now colleague, Paul, who's also a graduate from the history program. And so we are looking at the queer architecture of Lucknow. So the premise of the book is like, well, everybody says that Lucknow architecture is called Bangla and all that, and British, we know that. But then what we are arguing is that it was something which was done as a form of resistance to the colonial hegemony, but then as a form of resistance, it becomes a legitimate typology, which needs to be centered into the architectural history books. Why aren't like architectural history books have a certain kind of, architects coming in, we read architectural history and temple, space, and then we have modern architecture. So there is a typology which has had a very strong impact in being resistant to a certain kind of political imperialism or whatnot, and then because of that, it was violently destructive. So now we want to say that it is that queer architecture. We want to reclaim the word queer, and then we write about it. So in the methods, it's like, all right, what is it that is making it queer? Maybe it's disorienting, maybe it's theatrical, maybe it's gaudy, it's vulgar. So we are reclaiming all that. The evidence is still the archive, where British are saying, hey, it's vulgar, let's demolish it. And then we are saying, hey, it's vulgar, let's reclaim it. So the evidence is what you get. Sometimes you can't find evidence for which, something that has gotten erased. The other very quick example is the one that I want to give about Kolkata. Like again, it was a studio project in which we were looking at the histories of partition. And again, the history project itself, not design. So in the history, you have to, partition is a very sensitive topic. And there are millions of families got displaced, and there are millions of stories. There is one thing to archive that, but there is one thing to curate that. If you are creating a curation, then you have to be very, very sensitive about, selecting the evidence that you want to portray. And that is where, again, the methods come in. That is where your discursive or your political position comes in. And as an academic exercise, we again have a privilege, it's like very safe space, which is a university, which allows you to assert your political position. Maybe in the in the real world, your political position gets a little compromised, or you have to negotiate your way. But at least your political position or your ethical position, and definitely the discursive position, determines what evidence you extract to say what stories. So, for example, there's this one person who was just interested in looking at, what was a child going through when he or she was going across the border and things like that. So, curation based on just that and things like that. So, your evidence, in short, is probably in front of you. You just have to probably read it a certain way to make a certain case or to alter the narrative, as we say, change. Yeah.
So we have some very interesting ways of looking at how we connect data. And as you mentioned, the pattern in certain cases becomes a challenge in certain ways, becomes how you curate, because then that's essentially the output of the research, how you piecing your research to the others, which we want to connect it to the last bit of the research question that we have is, at the end, when we have conducted this research and we have our findings, we have our through the different methods that we have discussed in your thesis, how then do we publish this stage of the research? And now, as we discussed, there is a research which might not end up looking like an academic paper. What can these outputs be like? We were discussing in your case, there was artworks and such, and in your case, your output might be driven by the studio as well. And it allows you to go for your in-between studio weeks to read that piece as well. And what are these outputs which can be, apart from a research paper, what do they look like? What can we even imagine when we're talking about them?
I am more and more becoming convinced that research has to come out of the ivory tower of the academia and become more has to occupy a more public position, whatever that means. Because as academics, or we are survived through the society. We are not about them. So and I think that's like one of the biggest problems of academia is that if we publish, and publish in very difficult language, jargon, that it's read by people like us, we are not serving anything. We are only serving ourselves. So I do very strongly believe that the research has to have some more, it has to come to the public in some way. And I'm like more and more invested in, popular projects, like the artwork or especially so even like creating games, like creating games or marketing. So, but the thing is that criticality of the academia trains to be critical, to look at things, certainly to find out the contestations and injustices that are happening, to be able to reveal that. That is what academia trains you to. So the project has to be able to bring that revelation to the public, such that the public is able to either connect to that or participate in that. So, like for example, Chinmay and Tanvi and Pranjali but they did create a board game out of a very close reading of the archives of the politics of Lucknow, starting from National Congress to Akhilesh Yadav to Mayawati and then to BJP, what I think started in British times and so on. So how is each of the government doing the same thing, asserting the same narrative to claim certain spaces of power and make it their own? So then, it's like a creative game in which, you play those characters, and then the actions are coming from the archival research, where they take quotations from what, Akhilesh said, or what, Havelock said, British time, so on and so forth, or what Rajat said, Nawab said, so on. It's the same thing. So the quotations are then archival. Now, common people will not have access to. You have access to it. You have brought it up. But you make it into a board game and then it becomes public. Then it becomes normalized. Like, you don't only be able to market it, that's like your next challenge. But if it does get marketed, then like it becomes normalized. People start talking that same thing because they now read it. Similarly, like bringing your research about, whatever was the ecology of Kamkaria to the Kamkaria is now no longer talked about as an ecological thing, only landscape architects talk about it. But Kamkaria is now talked about in different ways. Katakoti and all that, and there's like something. So, you bring something that is there and then you bring it back to the public memory. So to normalize and to simplify without dumbing it down and bringing it to the people is, I think, the responsibility of academia. So while we have to publish because we have to sustain academia, it's expected of us, but I think it has to definitely be beyond publishing. That's not the end of research.
Yeah, I fully agree that research has to come out of the ivory towers of academia. And having been part of another art and design school, I think we are very interestingly kind of positioned to see methods and outputs very different, like say a design right? Or a researcher. For instance, this idea of research in academia, which is largely like recognized either in the written format, or now, of course, like there are journals that are slowly kind of trying to be a little more open to say photo narratives or pictorials, having more of illustrated versions. Some doctorate dissertations are also being done in the form of graphic novels. So if you go out there, I think this is something that is largely being looked at as what could be the other possible ways in which knowledge that gets produced in academia through research can be externalized. I think in terms of a creative practice, for me, even architecture is one of the creative practices that are there, which directly engages with the place. And that is where the research outputs could be your practice itself. So let's say you want to do a digital archive that is more place-based, right? So there are like ways in which you can make them today as compared to what it was, let's say, 10 years or 15 years ago. Right? And also technologies are becoming more simpler and accessible. Of course, it has its own kind of learning curve, but it allows you to kind of look away from the more conventional ways in which you can externalize your research. And agree with the other kind of research output possibilities like games, or it could be something like a film that you make. Like mediums and forms can be so many different things. Right? So maybe recently, I don't know how this will go, but one of our students is looking at learning to make other and capturing fragrances of places by making other. So that becomes like a research output where you go and learn about the place. There are stories, but then your research output is basically like a different other that you make, right? In a creative urban practice, I think there are so many possibilities. That is, you just have to slightly shift your direction from your core discipline to the peripheries of that discipline, because possibilities are really lying in those peripheries. Once you are right in the middle of the discipline, it can get a little rigid and restrictive, so to speak. Right? So, yeah, I think research outputs could be something that you want to kind of do, like say curation of evidence that Sonal was talking about some time ago. If you are interested, you can do that. Of course, you may not hit the right spot for the first go, but then you can take that kind of a risk, and you're taking that risk in order to learn, right? It's okay. You take that risk, you do it. If it doesn't work, okay, but you tried that and you learned something out of that, and now you can think another way. The second thing is also, I think, while these are like very exciting ideas and possibilities, but again, when it comes to research and knowledge, where the scholarship and how the scholarship is attributed is also one of the concerns. Right? So now when we're talking about co-authoring, how do we think about co-authoring, and also citing works that usually don't fit into, say, a regular academic framework. You must have all know about citations. It's one of the important things that you have to do when you're doing research, right? Like telling where your source is really coming from. And how do you then say a scholarship that is actually held by a community? How do you cite something like that? Or how do you then think about co-authoring, which will co-authoring not only in the textual way, even in the making part. Like for instance, we've had some very exciting collaborations between, say, researchers and farmers. Like farmers who can read the sky, and they can read the stars and tell, when, how the weather is going to change. Are the rains going to come early this time, or is it going to be delayed? So it's not like they're not basing it on data that is being recorded over a period of time and then drawing their insights from that. It's something that they've been doing as part of their living practice. Also, some parts that have been passed on from one generation to the other. And how do you then publish something like this, where a person who has contributed significantly to their scholarship of what are these stars telling us? And a researcher who comes from, say, landscape urbanism background, and when they collaborate, something new kind of comes, right? Because you need that common vocabulary when you start collaborating with people who produce knowledge in a different way. So immediately there are your research outputs also will start changing. We've had students where they are illustrators and collaborated with a folk singer and a calligrapher and make a book of songs or stories by collaborating with these other creative practitioners. Right? So creative practice is not something that is there only in university, right? It's there out in the world as well. So there are people who have been kind of doing these creative practices either in the form of art or craft or even in their production. We've had like collaboration with this another person again with the Walled City who actually makes things using tin boxes, tin containers, and we were thinking of putting that as an article in the journal. And then we had to think that now that we are writing the article about this person's practice, which basically the person has only told us, we are essentially narrating it, right? It's not something that we have in a way produced that knowledge. It's still the person's knowledge that we're talking about. So we had to think about ways in which we could bring their voice also. So can we? All these are like very exciting possibilities in a digital space. Not so much in the say printed format where some of these media cannot be kind of integrated, or maybe there is a way to kind of do that. So that's another exciting possibility. So we had to write and also annotate it with their voice. So the person in their own voice are narrating something, but somebody who's reading it is reading what we have written with an annotation over there. And just to kind of say that when you do research and the research output, again, when you start making this distinction that pehle, yes, I want to do research and then I want to make what this research output is. It's that kind of a linearity immediately kind of takes away a lot of the possibilities because we have to be more pragmatic in terms of the time also. Right? Take a lot of time just gathering evidence or data or information, and then you don't necessarily use it until the end. Then there is some kind of a pressure that you go through, and then you do whatever you can in that short period of time. But then look at research or methods as artifacts, right? The creative or made artifacts. So or learning artifacts, all the more. Right? So when you think of a learning artifact and you're making these learning artifacts linked to your research question, then you're constantly already producing things, more tangible things, while you are at it. Because I'm sure that you know what a learning artifact is. Something that you make, which will enable you to learn about something. Usually, like flashcards and all are like good example of a learning artifact. Like you have your competitive exam and you make these flashcards and keep kind of quizzing each other. Right? So now use that in the space of research and what kind of artifacts can you make? Right? So immediately it brings in your practice also, your research interest as well. And the making immediately brings in the aspect of method as well, because you are making while you are learning. So you don't see these as like separate processes. And by the end of it, you all also have a research output by the end of it, right? So, yeah, it's just shifting just the way we usually understand this. And for all of you, I think since mostly we have like students here, I think you should start questioning your curriculum to begin with, right? Because all these kind of thoughts and ideas are being introduced within the learning space, and not to kind of just take it for granted that if this is the curriculum, sahi bol rahe ho, right? So be critical about what you are learning also, and again, not in a space of like arrogance or like dissonance for the heck of it, but really like see what is that you are getting out of it. If something is given, just don't take it for granted that yehi research hota hoga, right? So we'll meet later. So open it up, have this kind of a dialogue now while you are in this kind of academic space. It's good that this kind of a symposium is being organized for these kind of conversations. But I think this should be something that you do almost on a regular basis in your try and kind of ask these questions within the context of your own work. Because these are ideas which are extremely difficult to transfer in a very short period of time. So yeah, start with where you are learning.
So these are some very, as you said, it's a short period of time in which we try to cover a lot of ground. And hopefully we take these discussions forward, but for right now, we have come at the end of our panel. And I'd like to summarize some of our learnings from the start. We started off talking about how we begin choosing a topic, how we looked at constantly, I think with both of you, we were looking at different modes of engagement and drawing some parallels as we spoke in the start was how we can allow the question to approach us. In the case of a place-based research, how just our daily experiences with the place helps us know and situate ourselves with the problems that we might not know ourselves, but the people who encounter it on an everyday basis know. And we looked at how it might be very important to understand a lot of trends and a lot of concerns that are plaguing us right now, and these become points we can latch on to. And we understood also how we can decenter from our discipline at the margins of the periphery of our discipline, like some very important ideas which can help us think about what itself has to be researched on. We went to understand what ways there are to extract information, and as Sonal said, that the regular method of choosing a lens helps you firstly filter out a lot of information. It tells you that when you're looking at a certain point of research, maybe some other lenses like how you said Heidegger's approach to looking at something might not be valid when you're looking at let's say another some political problems here. So in that sense, a lens will help us choose and filter our data. We talked about also the idea of expertise and how it ties to the first panel that we had yesterday, of how not wearing an expert's hat helps in the case of place-based research. How when we go on to curate these findings, we need to be critical about how we present them. And at the last, after discussing the various methods of research and how we collect data, your case, especially closely studying the case of Peter, and your case, you're working with the government and how government projects can be a very interesting, very significant that's an opportunity to tackle some of these problems. And towards the end, we also now summarize how these learnings can be published in that sense, apart from the research paper and various methods like board games and what was that? Yeah, photo essays and all we realize are being encouraged in the mainstream discourse as well. And we look also, as you said, at how these things can become learning artifacts, and how we can look at them through learning artifacts. And as mentioned before, through curations of the knowledge that we have gained. And I think in the summary of this entire panel, these lessons have been very interesting, especially for me and Yukta, I think, because at this stage, along with some of our batchmates, these present to us very alternate ways of looking at research itself. And Yukta, would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly opened up a lot of avenues of what we can expect when we're looking at what research entails. And I mean, half the things that you said, I've never even considered them, I never even thought of them. And this whole idea of just stumbling into, your area of interest, or allowing it to lead you and take you by the hand instead of just trying to reach out and guide yourself and trying to follow the straight line. I think it's opened up a lot of different ways of thinking about it. And I hope that it's done the same for everyone in the audience. And it was just wonderful having you guys around, getting to talk to both of you. I hope you enjoyed the panel as well. I hope all of you enjoyed the panel too. Yeah, sorry. If anybody, before we wrap up, if anybody in the audience has anything that they want to ask the panelists.
Since we are talking about research 101, so I think one of the important things that we can learn from the both of you is about the ethics and consent around research. I think that is something which is always we miss, or we don't talk much about it. So I want to know, Recently, I am not working a lot with communities or people, and my research is not, it's mostly in the archives, but that experience. When I was studying as a PhD student, and that time my research was ethnographic / phenomenological / archival. It was like an overlap of this thing. And we had to not just get the consent form signed and all that, but we also had to design the consent form. And so it was like in some way a fact check also that you write it. And then before it, that was very funny because I was working in Shantiniketan in Kolkata, 2 kilometers away from Kolkata, Shantiniketan University, right? And I was into it. So the same thing, like I did the same thing, allowing myself, I was living there for a few months, just making friends, talking to people, getting familiarized. And then one fine day, I'm like, hey, I will interview you. Do you consent? It's like, what is consent? I've already talked to you so much. So like, then became like some kind of formality. But I think it's very important to have that consent and not take, by for granted that, we can barge into any person's space, ask them questions, document it. It's not. And also consent form can be very political. So Ahmedabad, they have looked at this mega project of documentation of Brazilian properties in Ahmedabad. So I got shortlisted. I started working on it. It was a big project, and then I was like, true from that. There's a lot of problems with that, which I will not speak in public for. But they did say that, at the starting, when they floated the tender, they said, we help you get consent from the people. And the idea was that they floated it saying that we want to monetize, we want to understand the value of that property against which they can be given some, benefits, like some level it is an exercise in gentrification. So they wanted to do a valuation of the property and say, all right, this is what is the documented property. And so if you want to do the transfer of development rights, you'll get this much money. something like that. If you want to move your property, it's to stop people from demolishing their properties because now it's heritage. It's a big issue. So this will help you in getting consent. Now, when the project started, we realized that there is no consent. People don't give consent. And AMC is also very, very scared of that. So they'll help you give consent is like they give you a pro forma which you have to get it signed. I'm like, I don't agree to that. Like my political position does not allow me to get consent on and to do something that I'm probably not convinced about. So consent forms can be very, very political. And it's a very important question. Like I think the consent cannot come after the project. The consent has to come along with the commencement, like the initiation of the project. And that is where the community has to be very much already on page with that. When their properties are at stake, I think that has to be very, so consent precedes the project fruition, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, and also, I think this is where multiple realities plays a big role. As in, you as an expert or a researcher going there with a certain objective, maybe with whom you are doing it, they may be completely oblivious to your intentions, even in the beginning, right? So, I think research and ethics is not something that is done only like once. It is a process that has to be followed through throughout the process of your research as well. So it's not like, you take a consent, you do an interview, and then you have their consent for life, right? Because with whom you are working, they are also constantly kind of either learning or coming to terms with what exactly they are part of. In the beginning, I think what I'm talking about is very, very human, right? Like if somebody comes to you and wants you to be part of some kind of a study, you're definitely not fully understanding what their intentions are. Maybe they'll give you enough information as to what questions they are going to ask you, what will they do with the data. But then even in the course of, say, a research or research project, and see, in an academic space, a research project that goes on for, say, about 3 to 4 months is very different from, say, multi-year research projects that take place, where hundreds of thousands of dollars are being spent. And in that space, when you talk about ethics, it's a very different kind because it's all geared towards protecting the institution which is actually conducting the research. Or even in the case of like what Sonal was talking about, it is protecting the institution, which is maybe the government or the government department, saying that they have done their job. It's become more like a checklist. But when it comes to ethics, I think it's more you kind of engage with people or a place or communities. Their sensibility of what they are actually being part of also evolves. So which is why it's more situational. The ethics that, at least like the way we've been working, it is happens n number of times. Every single time, either we are making something publicly available, or even if you have made something with it, like you say do an interview and you have tried to do an inference or like interpret it in a certain way. You go back and you actually share that interpretation, right? It's just because you're not publishing it or publicly kind of making it available doesn't mean that you don't have to kind of go back to the communities there. Because these are all, I think you'll have to play out like scenarios, like multiple scenarios in your head. What you studied now, you may publish 5 years down the line, right? And at that time, you actually think about taking a consent. The person may be there, may not be there. You may be able to go there or not. So I would say that consent is something that has to be like the baseline. And also there are things around, I think communities should have a way to refuse, right? Because most often when you go to a place, consent is always seen as how do we explain to them what kind of rights they have and what does the consent mean in order to carry out the research. What if they don't want to be part of it? And most often this may not be a directly saying no, they don't want to be. So there will be very different kind of hesitations or indicators that they would give. And it's important to be sensitive to those aspects also, which is also very much part of ethics, right? So unfortunately, I think ethics part has become more like a checklist, a series of formality that you need to kind of do before you carry out your project or research. But it's something that should be cutting across like all the time in your project, irrespective of what method, what your research question, what you want to kind of learn. It's something that has to be there, and refusal has to be respected. And communities do that, by the way. They do kind of give you a lot of clues and hints. They may not be just using the same vocabulary or saying the same things. So if you all are like interested in building out some form of practice-based research or research careers, I think keep kind of reading these signs when you're there. Sometimes it could be like, aaj nahi kal aayi hai. And that happening some 2-3 times also should give you that signal. Or sometimes like, it could be where they are telling something to you and it is not something that is related to what you're asking them. It's not that they're not understanding your question, right? It's just that they don't want to kind of answer. Or even for you to figure out, is that what is happening? Give yourself all the time for that. So it happens in these very, very subtle ways as well. Yeah.
There is a tendency to say that what will be satisfying.
You're loud enough, it's okay.
So what I'm saying is, in continuation to that, is explaining my intention to them, which is very instinctive. Somebody misunderstands that why am I here, and from that moment, their refusal be. And now I'm like, my intuition is to explain it to them that what you are anticipating, it's not that. It's much more shallow. My research does not go as far by affiliation or by methodology. So would that be considered meddling with the ethics of consent, or is that like all right to do and just let them know what they're being a part of? Because sometimes then the answer changes. Many times only to do like a normal survey for my studio, I go out there and they feel like I'm from the government and I'm going to take over their house. And they say no. Some of them are pretty convinced that anything that I'm going to say is an excuse. So would that be considered meddling with the ethics? Or I don't know like what stand to take there. I'm the kind of person who would be like, okay, I'm so sorry to give you that moment of insecurity.
It's a very good question, and I think see when there is resistance, that has to be respected because it's coming from a point of vulnerability, and maybe you do believe very strongly that your project is not invasive, but they feel invaded, and that is important. So and I do feel that at some point you also have the right to put your point across. But then if it is received with resistance, I would step back. And that is where I don't agree that any project might be invasive. Now, even though the intention might not be, but because people have all the right to exercise their privacy in their private domain. So I think that is where it's a very, it's a difficult question. It's a relevant question. So I think we need to also understand as researchers where we step back. Yes, go ahead.
I think we believe that academic research is, or what we do within academic space is, you said that it's not going far. The thing is, a lot of our academic work does go fairly far now. Each time you guys put up, and I don't mean you guys, each time anybody puts up something on social media, you have put up something without somebody's consent. So I think, and I think architectural tutors, educators, students are completely oblivious to how we assume space is neutral. Each time you go for a measure drawing project, nobody has taken consent. All the measure drawing lying in so many architecture schools, all of it was done without consent. And we happily go into people's toilets, kitchens, wanting to measure everything. And a few years ago, we had gone to an Adivasi village, and the students came back, they're not letting us go into the room. I said, of course, we're not going to let you go into the room because it's a sacred space. So you have to only measure out what you can from the outside. So I think assuming that it's not going far is, it's really not recognizing that we are, especially as architects, we do that so often because we insist on measuring every part of the house, every part of the building, irrespective mandir hai, ye hai, wo hai. So it's become aware of the fact that each time you produce a drawing, all the measure drawing done since the school started is now in the archives, and all the archival material is in the public domain. So it is complicated, and as students who are doing research, you have to believe that when you're dealing with other people's spaces, you have to take permission, you have to respect their choices, and don't assume that your work is only in the library, because that line between what remains within the walls of the institution, what's going on, is very blurred right now.
That's where I questioned the verification, right?
I just want to add to what Gauri said, because once you start documenting, measuring it, you are actually, in other words, taking stock of people's living. It puts you in a very, very powerful position of power and makes them vulnerable. And now, like what Gauri was pointing out, now that is an archival material which is out in public domain. Imagine your house, the interior layout, out in the open. How vulnerable does that make you, right? So, and that is a project which has been done without consent over ages, where non-consent was the order of the day, right? So I need to call that out today and to restrict, to also to resist. And I mean, one of the reasons why I backed out from AMC projects is I will not take consent. The project had to be hinged on the consent. Only then it goes forward. So at some points, if you are able to, afford that, and if you can step away from the project, just go ahead and do that. I'm not saying that all of us are able to do that. Sometimes you're not able, but if you have the opportunity, please do that as well.
Can I just add one thing to that? See, again, there are before you, the question that you asked, before you arrive at that situation, right? There are a lot of choices that you're making in order to get yourself in that situation in the first place. Like starting with the tendency to kind of say that this is a new research that you are looking at, or picking a context that none of your peers or nobody has done any work with, and we generally tend to kind of ascribe this values to the work that we do, right? Like what you're doing is so unique that it has not been done before. The problem essentially starts from there, right? Because your research question, or say your research that you're interested in, if you start from a familiar place, where you have some familiarity with the context, if it is got to do with, say, people or communities, you have either made enough prefer to learn from other sources, or maybe you've gone there and you also kind of experienced it for yourself too, and not just like land up there and start with your fieldwork, right? So recce trips kiya jata hai. So there are different ways of like helping yourself also orient to the ground, right? If it is like a time bound thing and you have only shorter time, then always good to kind of go with something that you're most familiar with. When you have the time to orient yourself, then you can be a little more like more curious to go into like spaces that probably you haven't experienced. It's not your own reality, some other kind of reality that exists over there, right? So there are ways, these choices that you make in order to find yourself in that situation is also something that you need to kind of think about, right? And the second thing is creative practices, like I told you, are they open up many different possibilities, because when you want to take a photo, you want to do audio recording, or you want to measure document, there is a very specificity to that data that you're trying to kind of capture. Like say if you sit with someone and you want to kind of draw their home, and they can draw the way they want to. It's not specifics. Nobody can like very get a more real picture as to what it would feel like when they're there. It's not violating someone's privacy or like revealing say identities or their ways of life, but they are able to express the way they want to kind of express about their homes, right? So this is where like creative practices also come in extremely handy, where you can think about methods which are more which allows for people to be part of it, rather than looking at them only as like research subjects, or looking at that as a research site or a project site, right? And architecture in general is an invasive practice, right? You have to let go, you build without even wondering what that project is going to do to the place. But then always there is this aspect of futuring, like if this happens, this is what the future scenario for this neighborhood would look like, or this locality would transform like this, or this infrastructure is going to be so useful for this many millions of people, right? So that's a very different narrative that is there. But how do you then constantly ask these questions? Even like what Sonal was saying, that sometimes you can't really say no, or it's little too late even in the project to bring up these kind of conversations. Then how do you kind of negotiate with that? It's not about just leaving it. You may not find yourself in that situation. So, like I said, ethics is something that you have to constantly think about. It's not something that comes only in like certain moments of your research or project.
Thank you for the questions. So we have actually we're running into the next panel's time, so we'll have to wrap up the. And I hope it was fruitful for everyone who attended it. And I would pass my on now to the panel.
Sonal, Shreyas, Mannat and Yukta, thank you so much for engaging us in such an interesting conversation, and for everyone. I think it was a great dialogue that we had today. So we break for lunch now. We meet back here at 2:50, shift by 15 minutes. And the next panel is applications of research in the built environment. So yeah, looking forward to some more engaging and enlightening conversations. Thank you all for coming.